I hope it's been an engaging day and some good sessions and a lot to chew over. I'm really glad to be joined by three of my colleagues from Bloomberg News, and the idea is we will give you a bit of an insight into the things that we're looking at, the things that are exciting and interesting us, and of course one big topic on our mind and no doubt a lot of your minds is COP30. Not just the cost of the accommodation or where people are going to find somewhere to sleep, but also the topics on the agenda. Quite clearly, there's a lot of hard work to go in before that summit in November. Just recently, the UN's climate chief, Simon Steele, said, he couldn't sugarcoat it. They've got to go faster, further, and fairer to get things on track for what is, as we all know, a real pivotal point of the year for the climate sector. I'm most interested, I'm going to take a liberty here as the moderator and tell you what's interesting me first, and then we'll come to you. I must say as well, we are very, very interested to hear your questions. So we will hit briefly on the things that we're interested in, but hopefully you have questions for us because hopefully we can hear from you too. I'm quite interested in the climate finance question. Clearly, in Baku, in Azerbaijan last year, that was absolutely pivotal. The $300 billion that was pledged to be mobilized, to be provided by 2035, I guess that's already suffering from two problems. On one hand, it's seen as inadequate by much of the developing world, and on the other hand, it's not really clear if and how that's deliverable anymore. The Brazil COP presidency have a real desire to try and push that forward. They are gunning to get commitments that tip us closer to a 1.3 trillion figure. I'm fascinated to see how the discussions play out in November. I think at the Bonn meeting recently, the sort of midway point, the sort of, I guess, fork in the road on the way to COP, there were about 116 proposals put forward for what might work. So clearly, not a lot of consensus, a lot of ideas, but not a lot of action. And so for me, that remains a really crucial topic. Aaron, I'm going to come to you. And I guess one thing all of us have been looking at, not just for COP, but for quite a while this year, is the nationally determined contributions, those 2035 climate goals. Lots of nations didn't get their homework in on time in the February deadline. Singapore did, so congratulations to anyone in the room who was involved in that. What are we looking for? Are we expecting a wave of new national pledges?
Well, I think that's the hope, David. So less than 30 countries have submitted their NDCs so far. The original deadline was February 10th. Of the major economies that have submitted, the UK, the US, Canada, Brazil, and Japan, I think, according to Bloomberg NEF, we work with those people quite closely. Only Brazil and the UK, their plans really align with this net zero scenario that BNEF has mapped out. Other countries, the US and Canada, it's closer, but it's not true alignment with that trajectory. And of course, Japan doesn't align with that at all. I think going forward, what people are really looking for, they're looking for China and India's and the EU's NDCs. I think there's a lot of questions around India and how ambitious they're going to be. I think there's been a lot of talk that India may tie its how ambitious it is to the degree to which it can get financing, transition financing. So I think those are some of the things that people are going to be looking at going forward. And the new deadline, what everyone is pushing for at the UN is September submissions ahead of COP.
And we're expecting a big push even from the Secretary General himself.
Yeah, I think people are hoping that at least 100 countries submit NDCs by September.
If I can come to Sheryl, but just before I do, we do have two polls. And so it'd be great if we could pull up the first question and just allow people to use the QR code to begin to submit their answers. We'll come back to the results and talk more about it after Sheryl fills us in on some of the things that she's looking for as we head towards the Belém session. One thing I'm interested in is some of the other ideas that Brazil's put out there. There are lots of them. It's talked a lot about the hopes of launching a fund to protect tropical forests. is that progressing well? Is it of a big size? What do we know?
Yeah, so really interesting, David. I think it ties in a lot to the question that was posed earlier about how we can get from 300 billion to 1.3 trillion in climate finance. So I think Brazil's great hope is that this instrument that they are proposing will work and will help towards that. It's called a Tropical Forest Forever Facility, and what they plan is to have a $125 billion fund. The idea is that it's going to be blended, so we have a mix of public capital and countries that hopefully provide guarantees and loans at lower rates, and then you mix it with private and institutional capital to make that $125 billion. So what they hope is that of this money, they invest it in some sovereign bonds or corporate bonds from emerging markets. And then because of the difference between the borrowing costs and the returns made, they can then use the difference to channel it into forest conservation. So it's a really, really interesting mechanism. I think really innovative. I think the jury is still out as to whether the countries that they have approached do want to invest in it to kickstart it off, and whether it goes some way into helping forest conservation. So I think one thing that we're looking forward is to see like how it would affect how we look at nature and natural capital and price that. Because for conserving under this fund, if you have like a hectare of forest preserve, you get $4 every year as a country. And so, I mean, for Brazil, there's huge incentive here because of all the rainforest it has, and it could stand to have $860 million a year from this fund if it works. So I think we're really anticipating and looking as to whether countries do want to contribute to it and how the mechanism would be put in place, whether other countries would have access to it in addition to Brazil. So that's what we're looking at.
I mean, that sounds like there's potential for a tangible, real outcome. What our polling results are telling us is that within the room there's skepticism about other outcomes. As we can see, more than half of you who've responded are pretty pessimistic. And you know, not surprisingly, I guess we've seen a lot of conjecture, a lot of promises, particularly since the Glasgow COP that haven't necessarily delivered. And I guess we're also at a moment where there are question marks over the degree of leadership. The US has often been there at COP to often play the role as the bad cop. Unintended pun. But who fulfills that role? Who will be the one who's really driving the different groupings together to try and get some outcomes, and outcomes that can stick? So I'm not surprised to see that degree of skepticism. We will come back with another poll, so you're not done yet. Talking of disappointments, a perennial one has been adaptation and adaptation funding, but we're definitely seeing it much more on the agenda. Bigger focus, as we mentioned at Bonn at the recent sort of talks. There was, I think, a sort of discussion that whittled down 9,000 potential metrics to assess progress to just 490. So clearly some progress to go to decide on how to judge this, let alone fund it. I mean, what are we seeing in the adaptation space, Ishika?
Yeah, I think for COP, the biggest deliverable is going to be whittling that number down from 490 to 100 metrics for being able to track adaptation finance. The biggest question mark we hear is money. How are they going to track money, which is kind of the most important. So if that's delivered, that's going to be great. I was just at the global regulation deep dive earlier today, and there was a discussion about how we need regulation of adaptation as well on a country level, besides the national adaptation plan, right? How are regulators going to look at it? And I think if we have that deliverable out of COP, which talks about metrics, targets, that's a good starting point for then everyone to go away, all the countries to go away and start working on that. And we've seen adaptation coming up more and more amongst investors. I mean, when you have regulators, when you have metrics, chances are you're going to bring in more investors, right? It's a better regulated, better tracked space. So it can only be good. Of course, everyone can question whether over-regulation is good. But I think in adaptation, it's good because we don't have anything yet.
Quite. I guess one of the other things that we look for and are interested in, particularly when we're covering and our colleagues are covering COP events, are the people. And we saw some pretty always interesting characters, but we saw some very interesting examples in Baku. Whether that's India's government advisor, Chandi Rana, who's, if you recall, was very, very agitated at the end of the 2 weeks of negotiations and called out the summit conclusions as an optical illusion, certainly sort of really emphasizing that anger within the developing world and skepticism about the ability of developed countries to honor their commitments on financing. I'll come back in a moment to Chandi in India, but I wanted to come to Aaron. Aaron, you were in Busan for yet another set of UN talks on the hopes of a plastics treaty. But you had a chance to see and hear from Juan Carlos Monterrey, the Panama special representative, and who's certainly been a active, interesting character, that we've observed in these UN forums. I mean, what did you make of him, and sort of what are we expecting to see from him and from Panama at Bellum?
Yeah, so Juan Carlos Monterrey Gomez is, I think he's one of the most important sort of climate diplomats today. He grew up in a rural village in Panama. At 23 years old, he was the youngest head of delegation at at the Paris Agreement. And now he's the special representative for Panama. Like you said, David, I met him in South Korea late last year, and he is a larger than life character, and he's an electric speaker. I mean, I met him. He's walking the hallways, shaking people's hands. He's equally eloquent and aggressive. He wears a traditional straw hat. And he's just a force of nature within these talks. One thing that he's trying to do right now, which I think is really important and really interesting, is that so many of the conventions are sort of fragmented, right? We've got the main COP, the climate COP. We've got a convention on desertification. We've got one on biodiversity. And so one of his main efforts is to try to unify a reporting mechanism for all the major environmental and climate conventions. And so that's one thing that he's pushing for. But I do think he's going to be, a force within climate negotiations for many decades to come.
Oh, that's fascinating. Before I come to you, Ishika, because I wanted to hear about some of your recent experiences in Delhi, we do have another poll, as I said, and so if we can put the poll up, and we'll come back and have a look at your responses there. So as you decide about Asia's role in COP, as we said last time, Chandi Rana, the Indian advisor, was a really vocal participant in Baku. Ishika, you recently were in Delhi, spending some time and working there. Had a chance to talk to some people around the climate space and get a sense of how India is feeling about the upcoming talks and its sort of climate position. What was your sense? Is it a positive story in India about progress? Is it a story still of frustration?
Yeah, I think the latter. I think it's a story of frustration to do with international negotiations, but it's a positive story in terms of how the domestic laws and regulations are going, where they're going when it comes to ESG. Chandni is a larger-than-life character as well. I think she really trusts the idea that the global south has to have a voice. The low- and middle-income countries have to have a voice at the table of international negotiations. She said 300 billion is an optical illusion, and I think that's pretty much going to be... You've seen India hasn't even filed the NDC, right? And I think that's kind of them sending a signal as well that they're not happy with the way things have gone with climate finance. And we have no idea whether they're going to file it by September. There's been nothing out of the government yet. And I think that's kind of the tone they're going to take to COP this year, where they say, we want to see where the Baku to Belém roadmap leaves us with in terms of that $1.3 trillion. We want to see whether the Sharm el-Sheikh dialogue brings in more money for coal-dependent nations. They want money to come into nascent technologies like green hydrogen. They're getting money from foreign investors for solar and wind, for example, but these are established technologies. There's enough of a domestic base for them. They want to see richer nations give them more money. for things where where India doesn't have enough capital. So I think that's what they're going to go to COP with. What's helping India now is what I said on regulations. They're developing rules around carbon markets. They're developing rules around sustainable finance, though the draft taxonomy was not as detailed, I would say, as some other countries, such as Australia. But they're starting to get the ducks in a row to be able to attract foreign investments. So hopefully, they can work together with everyone in the room at COP and not have another optical illusion moment.
No, that's fascinating. That's interesting. And interesting also the results that we see of the polling. If we can bring those up, quite a spread of opinion. Champion of practical solutions. I mean, I guess that's something I'd love to hear more about, actually, in terms of what Asia can show to the rest of the world. And quite interesting there. All of you, I guess, expecting that there has to be a role for government, and that we can't simply rely on and depend on private capital to step in. If we do have any audience questions, I think it'd be great to start to tackle some of those.
I'm ready for you.
Excellent.
Hello.
So we do have a mic.
Yes,
right down
you
there.
do. Hi, everybody. You guys have a question about tariffs, and given the fact that the world has rightly been preoccupied with them since they're such an immediate effect, how many years do you think this has set the net zero agenda back?
Wow, that's
one for you, David.
difficult to say. I mean, what I can say, and what we heard and listened to just this morning, we had very lucky to have a session on tariffs and heard from people like Mary Young, the former Canada trade minister, and I guess the conversation there was like to paraphrase the chilling effect that tariffs are having on investment decisions, full stop, and therefore. The impact of that is that investments into decarbonisation are also being hampered, and of course the overall effect is to slow down efforts at reducing emissions and to slow down the energy transition. So, to quantify how many years, I guess it's difficult, but clearly the impact is negative. I think the other interesting point is this is not just a US tariffs story. We've certainly seen, particularly developing countries, really bristle at some of the mechanisms like CBAM and the EU. Tariffs and the trade agenda and trade nationalism is certainly it's on the agenda for climate diplomats and negotiators who'll be heading to COP, and it feels like a really tangible, important topic to grasp. Anyone else with thoughts on tariffs?
I can share another tariff impact. It's not about net zero, but I remember when Liberation Day happened. I was talking to private equity and private credit funds, and they were expecting, and I'd love to know from the room, from the audience, they were expecting a wave of take-private deals across the globe in the clean energy sector. Because, of course, stock market valuations had plunged, which has slightly changed now. But they would get a discount. And it's easier to rejig supply chains away from the public eye. So they felt like a lot of investors were on the lookout for companies in the clean energy sector. We're tracking it, not sure how much that's played out yet, because there's also so much uncertainty with tariffs, so people don't want to jump the gun, right? But yeah, that's another impact we're seeing.
Do we have any more questions?
Oh, yes, you do.
We do. Excellent.
I'm going to put you on the spot again. Which country in Southeast Asia do you think has made the most progress on ESG, and which one still has the furthest to go? We're naming names.
I think our residents of Southeast Asia can take that. Sheryl, do you want to take it first?
Maybe we'll go with the laggards first. I hope no one is in the audience from Indonesia. So I think one of the reasons why is because of the political instability. So with the change in administration, there's been a lot of disruption to business plans. So, for instance, in the green space, right, there had been hopes that Indonesia would drive flows into the carbon market, being such a country endowed with rainforests. But I think what has happened with all this administrative back and forth changing of rules is that project developers for carbon on the ground have been really hampered, and they don't really want to invest anymore. And I think another area we're watching closely for Indonesia has also been the energy transition away from coal-fired power plants into hopefully more renewables. And I think like one big area everyone was watching were these JETP, Just Energy Transition Partnership programs, in which they are supposed to get some funding and then like phase down coal power plants ahead of schedule and cut emissions. But that deal has really stalled. Of course, this is not all to say that that is Indonesia's problem. I think there have also been really thorny negotiations with other countries, and the issue of whether developed nations are keen and they have the appetite to be funding these in the changed environment now. So I think on those ends, you know, in terms of like what could have been a positive in green development, carbon markets, and also in the coal space, which is such a big contribution to emissions, I would say that Indonesia and the political instability have really disappointed some watching this space. And maybe like one of my team members would like to continue on a more positive note, who has made the most progress.
Ishika, as someone who's also Singapore-based.
Thanks, Sheryl. Okay, because I'm supposed to look at regulations, I'll be biased here and say Singapore. I know there are many problems, there are many things that the country can do better, but within Southeast Asia, to me, it's a leader in terms of developing a climate finance hub, developing regulations around it, trying to work with the region. I mean, its own contribution to global emissions is minimal, right? But it's trying to figure out a way to reduce emissions across this region with traction, with FAST-P, all those acronyms that you have. So yeah, Singapore for me.
Well, I'm based in Melbourne in Australia, and so you know a little bit removed from the region. But the conversations that I have, you know, talking to people very focused on whether it's financing in the climate space or renewables projects development, they're very effusive in their praise of policy in places like the Philippines, in Malaysia. Those are you know suggested to me as places that are really starting to get their settings right. And additionally, I think we're seeing, I hesitate to say, but you know, Vietnam, it may be turning a corner. There's been you know lots of hope and optimism that they would get their sort of energy settings right for a long time. But I think we're beginning to see you know some progress, and that's reflected in some of the investment decisions we've seen into Vietnam recently, and certainly executives who have manufacturing facilities, people who are you know dealing with the practical realities of climate change and climate policy on the ground there are beginning to talk in a much more positive sense about Vietnam. So I'll offer those. Aaron, I mean, unless obviously based in Japan, so you feel free to duck the question if you like.
I might dodge the question on Southeast Asia. I think from a Japan perspective, I mean, I think you know, their transition is quite a bit different than many countries, although it's similar in some ways because they're dependent on oil and gas, like many countries here. But Japan's, you know, transition plan, which, as I mentioned earlier, is doesn't really align with the Bloomberg NEF net zero transition, is highly reliant on co-firing coal and gas plants with ammonia and hydrogen, and so a lot of that is technology that's not commercial at this point, and as well as CCS and carbon capture and storage. So a lot of those things, there's a lot of questions to still answer about Japan's transition pathway, I think.
Sure. And of course, in addition, quite interesting and innovative on the financing side as well. Like with Japan, we've seen sort of transition bonds and seen the development there. So there's equally active. Do we have any more questions? I do have, I don't know if we have a mic. I do have
Well, actually, we need to wrap up because I think a few of you have a breakout to get to, David and Ishika. So we are going to wrap things up. If you have a final word at all, please go ahead.
We can
take
one final question, or okay.
If we can take one from the floor. Okay, absolutely, please.
Thank you. I have been working in the ESG industry for 15 years in Singapore. I'm from China. So I have two puzzles. For many years, we tried to convince China to embrace ESG. Now China becoming, increasingly love ESG. But meanwhile, the West, especially the US, is abandoning ESG. So how to convince China to continue to do this? And the second puzzle is that I see many companies who are doing ESG business themselves are not sustainable. Many bankrupted. So this is a question posed to our ESG guys. How to make your ESG business sustainable?
Right. Forgive me, just because we're short on time, I'll take the first part of that question, and I think essentially it was about sort of China leadership, and I think that's really apt. We just saw in Beijing, a summit between EU leaders and China, and a real commitment there that China will step up, as we said. China's NDC, we're expecting before COP, and what we've heard from President Xi is that will be genuinely ambitious and sort of set the tone, not only, I guess, for government, but also for businesses across China. And as he said, that will be economy-wide, involved, not just be carbon dioxide, but it will be targeted at all greenhouse gases. And so I think the expectation is, if that's ambitious, it can really set the tone for China, but also show China as an example of leadership. So hopefully that addresses some of your question. I think that's it for time. I want to thank my panelists, Ishika, Sheryl, Aaron. Thank you all for your questions and for your responses on the poll. Thank you very much.